Welcome back to the Institute for Black Male Studies. I am Dr. T. Hassan Johnson, founder and lead scholar at the Institute. And today in our interview series, we're going to be talking to a journalist that I have a great deal of respect for, a brother whose work I've been following for the last year and plan to, share as much of as possible, particularly on YouTube and Twitter. This is brother Tauren Walker, who is the founder and editor of Context Media Group and a writer, journalist, and social media influencer with over 50 bylines and publications, including Teen Vogue, Huffington Post, Splinter, Race Bait R, or Race Baiter. He's the producer and director of the documentary 5 Years, Mike Brown and Ferguson Now, and the creator and host of Wednesday Wisdom, a news and information web series. Tauren is currently writing a book on the intersections of race, gender, power, and culture in American society. Let me see here. You can also find, he has a YouTube channel. If you look up Tauren Walker, you can find it there. Please make sure you do so and support, become a member, a subscriber, I should say, on the channel. And some of his recent press you can find in Black Male Publishers Bring Necessary Voices to Digital Media Industry, Citizen Ed Roundtable, Let's Talk About Building, Power for the Black Community Beyond Voting, Renegade Culture Podcast, Black Gender Wars, Are Black Men Going to Be Blamed If Trump Wins? And Tim Black Election 2020 Results and Analysis with Tauren Walker. So let me welcome him now. How you doing, brother?
I'm good, brother. How you doing? Thank you for having me on.
Oh man, thank you for coming, man. I'm like I've been telling people, I'm definitely a fan because you are one of the most courageous journalists that I've run across, and I'm digging everything I'm seeing you doing. Today, I'd like to, as I do with these interviews, give people kind of a snapshot of your life and how you got to where you are, so that people, particularly young brothers, might be able to find some direction in some of your experiences. So if we could start, tell us a little bit about where you're from and how, what were some of your initial experiences up through high school that kind of started to show us what direction you might be going in later in life.
Okay. Well, I was originally born. Well, I was born in Jacksonville, Florida. That's where I'm from. From there, I was always into the spoken word and the written word. I've always had a love for books. I've always had a love for information and information exchange. Apparently, according to my family, I was reading in the newspaper when I was 3 years old. I was writing when I was like 4 or 5, and I've always just had a love for that, being able to like take thoughts, take ideas, and translate them onto the page and into different avenues. I did that when I was up. I did that when I moved into. I was always a wordy, talkative kid. I was always watching the news. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher. So I kind of learned from watching him how to translate feelings and emotions and what the masses were feeling back to them so they could understand what they were feeling. And I was just watching him. He taught me a lot growing up. My grandmother was a very cultured, really creative woman. She was always into music and art. And I remember she would bring me records and everything and let me listen to stuff from, jazz to opera to, orchestra music and everything in between. She never had any kind of discrimination about what she let me listen to. And I took that with me up until out into the world. High school, I was a musician. I played the bass. I played the saxophone not well. I was always in creative spaces, but I was always trying to do something that tied into creativity and words. I used to be in the hip hop. I tried to rap. There's some demo tape somewhere in my old house that I hope to never see the light of day. And I got into that to say that, from high school up until um, higher education, I got into writing professionally. I did that through blogging and just talking about like city life and talking about things in general. And that's how I started moving into more professional writing.
Just to let you know, there's some hidden cassettes of me rapping too that I hope will never be found. So I feel you on that one. How would you say, what kind of student would you say you were, from especially middle school to high school? How would you characterize the kind of student you were?
I think I was a pretty good student, but not in the traditional way.
Mm.
I was in gifted classes from the 6th grade up until like the 10th or 11th grade. And
Okay.
I think what my family and I think what the school system was expecting me to do was to kind of like take that and move into like traditional avenues, like become a doctor or become a lawyer,
Hmm.
something like that. And
Hmm.
I did think about doing that at some point, but I was always drawn to creativity. I was always drawn to music. I
Yeah.
was always drawn to like art, drawing, stuff like that. And when you grow up in a city like Jacksonville, you don't really get a lot of encouragement for things that are a little bit more esoteric than going into hard professions that are going to bring you money. And so
Right.
there was a lot of conflict about that. I pushed back against a lot of that. I had to deal with that from my family, but they were always supportive, even though they didn't understand it. I didn't get a lot of support from like the education system because in Florida it's all about there's a lot of things that go on in Florida. Like if you're a black male, if you're not overly smart, they either want you to toe the football or play basketball. And I did play basketball for a while, but
Hmm.
that was never really my calling, and I didn't want to go into that. And that's when I first started paying attention into about the stereotypes and the boxes that people want to fit you into. Because when I said that I didn't want to really pursue like being a doctor or that sort of profession, that I said I like to play ball, everybody was rocking with that. Like, go get
Hmm.
this ball. We'll take
Hmm.
you out here and let you stay to the middle of the night if you want to. You'll go run
Right.
this ball. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I liked it, but I didn't like it that much, and I wasn't that good. You know what I mean? So
And that's real when because that moment, that revelatory moment where you say, I'm not about to be the next Michael Jordan. I'm not about to be the next Kobe Bryant. You know what I mean? And
mhm.
I could either keep pushing this, even though I know I don't have that kind of talent, or I can invest in myself. I can take a risk on myself, even though I don't even know what I want to do yet. You know what I mean? I don't know if you had that kind of moment, but I know I did pretty early. I was good at the park with the ball, but I wasn't about to go pro. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't. First of all, I never really had that real heavy aggression that you need to
Oh,
play really ball to go from one thing to the other for college or whatever. I
yeah.
just like playing, and I was halfway decent. And plus, I was tall and a skinny dude, in eighth and ninth grade. So, if you're a if you're a high school coach, you see a tall, skinny black dude. The first thing you do is, hey, come over here and play this ball and everything,
Oh yeah.
and you
Oh
get
yeah.
aggressive about it. So when I realized I didn't want to do that, there was a lot of disappointment, and I felt like some. I never felt like any lack of self worth, but I
Mhm.
could tell that a lot of people around me who were trying to rock with that, like, yeah, well, you go ahead and figure out what you're gonna do. I'm gonna wash my hands of it.
Right.
Yeah.
So take us before we leave high school.
Mhm.
The environment you were in. I understand what you mean when you say there's only a couple of professions that most, especially Black folk, can grasp. I mean, if you say, I want to go be an accountant, people just look at you. You say basketball. If you say, there's just a couple of professions that people readily identify with. But how would you say? How else would you describe the environment? Was it hostile? Or was it just kind of mildly difficult? Like how intense, or what were the kind of struggles you had at that time in the environment you were in?
Well, like I said, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay.
And Jacksonville, if nobody's ever been there, if you don't know, it's a very working class, blue collar city. The majority of Black people in that city are struggling to get by, or they're working 9 to 5 jobs, and that money goes straight to either cover their expenses and put food on the table. So people don't really think any further than what they can do as far as the next paycheck. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Not everybody, but that's a very strong element. So
Right.
you have kids that grow up in that, um, who don't really have the opportunities to think further ahead than that. So everything they're thinking about is, what can I do to get me a little bit more that day? You know what I mean? Well,
Sure.
playing ball do it.
Now,
Well,
were you gifted with the pen at that time? Were did you know you had a gift when it came to writing, or what did you have a sense of that at that time?
yeah, I think I'd had a gift for creativity. I think I knew it at that time. This was right about the time where I was starting to get into hip hop, and this was like when hip hop was starting to become, a mainstream global phenomenon. So I saw these brothers who were like, going all the way back to like Run DMC, NWA, Ghetto Boys, all these people who were able to paint these pictures with words and music, and
Right.
that really appealed to me. And I tried to get into hip hop. So I was
Yeah.
in a couple of hip hop groups, and I used to DJ as well.
Oh,
So
okay.
I put a lot of my creativity into that, which again, that was something that became tangible in the South, because people saw you could make money from doing that, or you could get some sort of notoriety from being in hip hop. Outside, it was basketball, football, and then music. So I
Right.
gravitated towards music. So people started supporting me with that.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think people around me understood that had some gifts and I had some talents that needed to be nurtured.
Yeah.
But I also had to figure that out for myself. You know what I mean? Because there wasn't a support system for that at that time. You know, people were trying to eat, people were trying to
Yeah.
hustle.
Yeah.
I know that there were a lot of brothers in my circle, 15 and 16, who I know were on the block doing their thing. And they
Hmm.
purposely kept me away from that because I guess they saw that they didn't want me getting caught up in that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think if I had any support, it was like people who were actively saying, "Nah, keep away from this. Go do what you're doing. Everything. Stay rock with that."
You
You know
know,
what I mean?
I'm so glad you brought that up because recently I had somebody who was trying to tell me in a video he was doing, oh, you know how it is when you're bullied and this, and I was like, actually, I went through a period where the brothers on the block, as you point out, were actually very protective. And it wasn't an isolated thing. I kind of saw brothers telling stories like that around the country where some of the
Mm-hmm.
hardest, brothers who were out there doing all kinds of illegal things, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time had a very protective element when it came to some people. You know what I mean? They would tell you when to leave a situation. They would tell you, we don't want to see you, involved in any of this. And sometimes some brothers even talked about they would help finance, their families and, give them a few dollars here and there just to keep them out of trouble if they saw you had a gift or potential in some kind of way that wasn't part of that traditional narrative of football, basketball, music or drugs. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing that up because that's another element that we don't really talk about that happens. So
Yeah, no, that's real, man. It's like I think people get this one-dimensional image of what, like, for lack of a better term, hood life looks like. You
right,
got the bad, but you also have the good, and you also have brothers who are in that who see people who have potential, man, and they see people who ain't built for that life or don't really want to be in that, or they have different gifts, and they go out of their way to either try to help those brothers out or tell them in their way to keep away from this. I mean, I remember times when it's like, because this is my peer group. You know what I mean? I want to rock with y'all. Y'all my peoples and everything. We all out here on the corner. We laughing, we talking and stuff. But
right,
there were times where like they say we finna go out of town. I was like, man, I'll ride with y'all. And no, you ain't. Stay where you at. Go back to your house.
right, right, right.
I'm thinking,
Yeah,
you know how it is, man. You got that double consciousness where like in the back of your mind, whatever's going on is what on. You don't know it for real, but you're still your people. You
exactly.
want to rock with them. But
Yeah,
they're like, nah, partner, go back to your mama house. Stay in there.
yeah.
Like that. And that happens a lot, and people don't talk about that.
No, it's a very protective kind of thing, and I think even in the academy, more people need to actually theorize on that because it really breaks from what many of the assumptions made, especially about young black men. But so right around the end of high school and transitioning beyond that, tell us what happens with you around that time, 17, 18 years old, I presume. What
Mm-hmm.
happens after that? Where do you find yourself, and what kind of things are you getting into?
Well, after that time, that was around the time I started working full time. I didn't go to I didn't go to higher education right away. I needed some money, so I worked, and I was working, and I was also still trying to pursue music. So I was like, what was I working? I was working at like some little rinky-dink chain restaurant and everything. But at the same time, at night, I was still like write rhymes, and I was still doing my DJ thing. Shout out to my man, rest in peace, Gerard. He put me on with his DJ group in Jacksonville, Money Up Front DJs. We go around and do parties and stuff like that, and we get money that way. Um, I took that and I just kept parlaying that and trying to do demo tapes and trying to like get signed to record labels and stuff like that. Me and my homeboy Frank, who I haven't seen in years, we were doing that, going around Florida and Georgia trying to hook up something. When I realized that wasn't going to pan out, I moved up to Atlanta, and Atlanta at the time was like, you know, for like the Black Mecca. If you were coming out of school, you were semi talented or you had something, you go to Atlanta, you can get a job. So that's what I did. I came up there,
Now,
and
what
I was
what time frame are we talking about?
you talking about like in years and whatnot.
Yeah, what years? Yeah.
This would have been 96, 97 is when I came up there. Um, this was like when the economy was purring like a kitten. This was when you could go up there, get a gig and something like that. And also that fell into the same time where like the Atlanta hip hop scene and Atlanta music scene was booming like crazy. You had all these hip hop acts that were coming out of Atlanta. You'd already had like Outkast, Goody Mob, but then it's like you saw people like Luda and people like that who were like doing big numbers, not just in the South, like worldwide. So I got pulled into that. I was doing like some preliminary work on a couple of like projects and stuff like that, and I was getting introduced to a lot of people in that world. And it was looking like that was gonna be my calling to go into music, which is still kind of like my first love, music and that sort of creativity. But the reason I didn't do that was because I was always afraid of sitting down at a desk and signing something because I knew what I didn't know. You know what I mean? I knew that if I jumped into this world with no real understanding of how this world works, and this is right about the time like the TLC horror stories were coming out and all these stuff were coming out about people getting jacked and everything like that for their royalties and their money. So I never really signed anything, and that's when I decided, why don't I just go in? Why don't I just put this down? Let me go into the corporate world. Let me just do that, and I'll just try to figure it out as I go along. So I kind of put that on the back burner. I started going into like, I got a corporate gig. I did that for about 4 or 5 years in the insurance company. That was when I made the most money on a corporate level in my life, but I was also the most bored, man. I felt like I was brain dead.
Hmm. Damn. So how long did you do that, and what decisions did you make after that? What did you transition into after that?
I did that for about, let me see, I did that for about 5 years total. Um, and the thing about it, I was actually pretty decent at it because there was an infrastructure in Atlanta that fed young black men into, the middle class. Fed you into like if you go get a job at a corporation, put on a suit, put on a tie, whatever, stay in this cubicle, you'll eventually get onto this track where you can, get a house, get everything you need. And I was on that track, you know what I mean? Because all those opportunities were there, but there was just something in me that just didn't let me be satisfied with that. You know what I mean? I would do things like on the weekends, I would go out and I'd go to like little urban hip hop spots. I would go to like spoken word places like that, and I would link up with people who were doing that stuff. And at one point, I thought what I was going to be able to do is maybe like finance some of these things that they were doing because all these brothers and some of these sisters were like getting their music career started off. Like I'm talking about like India.Arie, people like Erica would come through there, and like there was a spot in Atlanta called the Yin Yang Cafe at the time where all these artists would come through. People like trying to think like Johnny, somebody like Big Boy would come through. People like that would just show up and perform and stuff like that. Joy, and I thought because of my connections in in the corporate world, maybe I could do something like be an underwriter or producer for some of this stuff. But that didn't work out because I wanted to perform. I never got the courage up enough to get on stage and do any spoken word because some of these brothers were knocking it out the park. I probably should have, but I had real bad stage fright at the time. I knew how to do hip hop and I knew how to do rap, but what these brothers was doing was something different, man. So I didn't do that. So I left that alone. But
Mhm.
but what happened with the job was when the stock market crash hit, I took a hit with that.
Okay.
So when everything fell in, everybody was out of work. I was okay for a while because I had saved up, but it also allowed me time to kind of like go out and play around and explore some of this stuff. So I was like going to like venues all the time, checking this stuff out and making links with people who were doing creative stuff. And from that, I got into, just being in that creative circle,
Mhm.
making those people my base of operations and making those people my friends
Yeah.
and building on that. And I was kind of moving away from the corporate structure, moving away from that corporate sort of like that corporate culture, you know what I mean? Because there's a culture in Atlanta at the time. There was this sort of like this idea of black culture where it's like, if you go work these jobs, if you work these jobs, you live in these areas. If you live in these areas, you hang out with these people. If you hang out with these people, you go to these places right here. And that's when I really started becoming aware of class divides in black culture, because that's when I started seeing that like you have black people who've lived on the promise of all these things that Martin Luther King believed in and the idea of the city being too busy to hate. But there's also real strong class divides between black people who go to these schools, work these jobs, and the way they treat other people who don't have some of their skill sets, maybe they aren't as degreed up as they are, and maybe don't have some of these same cultural signifiers that they do. So I started peeping that stuff, and there were things I didn't like about it.
Okay. So from there, right? Uh, what, what
Mm-hmm.
what did you begin to transition into from there? And are you starting to transition into looking at different forms of media as well, or what? Tell us what happens from there.
Well, that's when I discovered. That's when I started discovering social media. At the time, it was Facebook. Facebook was a new thing at the time because you could pretty much write out your thoughts. You could share this with the wider world, and you could get immediate feedback from that. At the time, I wasn't thinking about writing professionally. I was just like, this is something I could do every day. I'm thinking this, I can put this out, get immediate feedback. I did that for a couple of years, like almost every day. I was probably obsessed with it because, it was something new. This was at the start of the information age where you can put your thoughts out and you can get immediate response to what you're saying. And that was a new novel thing, instead of just like writing something in a newspaper, you might get a letter to the editor back. What really put my transition into being a professional writer was I started blogging. I used to have a blog called Some City, and it was sort of like a nightlife blog. This would have been around 2012, I believe. I did it for like a year and a half. I would just basically go out, talk about dating life, talk about single life in Atlanta, talk about the culture, that sort of stuff. And what really transitioned me from doing into that to doing more serious pieces was when Trayvon Martin happened. That was sort of my epiphany.
Okay.
Because when Trayvon Martin died, I think Trayvon Martin, well, when he was murdered, when he was killed,
Mm-hmm.
that's the first time that was the first time that the deaths of Black males lined up with the information technology that allow everybody to share their views and their opinions about what happened.
Yeah.
So at that time, it wasn't something that wasn't unusual to me because growing up in Florida, I had a lot of people who had died, either in that game or through police violence or in that fashion. But those were stories that really were circulated amongst ourselves. The newspaper would basically report what the police narrative was. But when Trayvon happened, that's when you started seeing people talking about, the injustice that happened and what happens to Black bodies in this society and how people feel like they can police Black bodies and take them out if they feel threatened by them. And when you saw that, you saw a lot of people who were not Black and some who were talking on a social level and everything was gravy because we never got into really heavy politics. But when that happened, a lot of people started showing their true colors. I started seeing a lot of white people who would otherwise be friendly with you start going into this thing that we see now where what was he doing out there? Well, he was no angel. Well, what was he doing out there to make people suspicious? And I started firing back against that. And I was saying, no, this happened because there's a history of this sort of thing in America. And sometimes you don't think about these things that are sitting in you dormant until they're provoked, and then you start finding your voice. So that's where I started finding my voice. I started talking about these things on a regular basis and kind of educating people and fighting with people and cussing some people out. It went all those ways. And I
Right.
lost a lot of that friend group that I built up started drifting. I started noticing they started drifting off
Okay.
because they were getting exposed to things that they hadn't been exposed to before. This was a culture where everybody was hanging out, drinking, partying, and everything, and it was all great until this happened. And that made people start really exposing who they really are and how they felt about this stuff.
Yeah.
So from that, I started shifting my blogging into talking about like Black issues, police brutality. I
Yeah.
started talking about like just being a Black man and what you're dealing with, being stopped by the police, this stuff. Being a Black person and trying to deal with Black women in this environment, and how that works and how those dynamics work in the tension that creates when you're trying to survive in a society. That got me the attention of a couple of major platforms because right when I started doing that, about a year and a half after that, Mike Brown was killed.
Okay.
That's when everything blew up around the world. You know what I mean? That's when these spaces that we were talking about and these issues that we were talking about, the whole world saw it. And that's when you started seeing these uprisings all around the country, major marches, people in St. Louis turning up, riots, protests, uprisings, fires everywhere. And people were trying to figure out what the hell is going on because they never really had to deal with this before. And I was placed to really start talking about that. And because of that, and I was talking about that blogging on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Somebody at the Huffington Post reached out to me and they said, "We noticed you're talking about this stuff on a regular basis. Would you be interested in maybe writing for us?" And that came out of the blue. I didn't expect that. And I said, yeah, if you're interested in hearing my points of view, I'll be happy to talk about that. So that turned into a regular writing gig for the Huffington Post. I was at the Huffington Post from I think 2014 up until the middle of 2015, and I was filing daily stories about protests and Black life. And that was at the time, right after Mike Brown was murdered. That's the next. I think the next thing that happened was Freddie Gray, and then Baltimore exploded. And then not too long after that, that's when the type situation happened with Walter Scott in Carolina. Then it was Alton Sterling, then Philando Castile. You know how it was? It was something like every week there was a new dead body, and there was a protest on top of that. So I covered that beat for like about a year and a half. And that's when I really started seeing like a lot of my literary muscle starting to grow, because I had to deal with all this stuff and I had to put it in a space there for people to be able to understand. They weren't just Black, because my byline was Huffington Post of Black voices, but I know way more people were reading that because people were getting, they wanted to know what these stories were about. They wanted to know the backstory behind why so much of this stuff was happening. So I gave them that. So that's how that started.
Wow. So you kind of organically fell into journalism. Did you did you notice early on the difference between yourself and those who were, trained by traditional methods in journalism? What did you notice about the difference in your experience in terms of that background, but also in terms of you being a Black male? What were some of the things you noticed about how you were kind of received and what you experienced?
What I noticed was people who went through formal journalism training, because I didn't go to J school. I was just a naturally trained writer, but I knew and I studied enough about journalism, about how traditional journalism is supposed to work, about objectivity and about being able to check your sources and everything like that. And I never had a problem with that. But what I saw from people who work in traditional journalism, who matriculated through J school and everything like that, I noticed that there was a sort of, even though they say that there's no bias, there is a bias that comes from mainstream journalism, because mainstream journalism at this point in time has to be a cash cow, and it has to be something that generates revenue. Traditionally, journalism used to be a lost leader in America, because if you didn't have money involved in your stories and you didn't have money involved in your journalists, in your newspaper journalism side, you could afford to pay journalists to be completely objective, to the point where they didn't have to be beholden to who their paycheck was, where the stories, all they had to do was be credible. All they had to do was be honest and be objective. That's pretty much gone away now. You have to talk about things in a way where you don't offend the people who are your shareholders. And I saw a lot of that when everything was going down with Black struggle, with a lot of the Black protest movement that was going on. I saw who they were talking to. There are a lot of people from mainstream journalism were not going to the streets trying to get the point of view of people who were out there protesting, and they weren't really trying to like get into the meat of why people were out there. It was basically just, you know, this has been torn up. These people are moving here. The destruction is on this part of town. The protests and the rioters, as they call them, is moving here. Here's the police version of what's going on, with very little pushback to the police narrative and very little information into the lives of why people are reacting the way they do. That's what I think I was doing as a little bit different, because I was actually trying to go and talk to people who were protesting on the ground and trying to figure out why they were out there, what they were doing, why they felt like they had to go to the streets as much as they could. And I also tried to go into the background of why these people were out there, because there's always a backstory to this. Things don't happen in a vacuum. Some of the protests that we saw over the past 4 years happened because people were fed up. They were, a lot of these people's backs were to the wall. A lot of them have been dealing with generations of police brutality, with discrimination, with marginalization, and economically. And nobody was talking about that. So that's what I think the difference was. I was talking about that stuff, and other people weren't. For some reason, either they weren't allowed to, or they were
Mhm.
afraid to.
You mentioned a little while ago you started to look at some of the tensions on the grounds of gender that were going on. Were you seeing any of that in terms of what did this new wave of activism after Mike Brown's death? What were some of the things you noticed in regard to gender, whether it had to do with behind the camera, in front of the camera? What were some of the things you noticed?
I didn't see so much behind the camera at first. I noticed that a lot of people were focused on basically just getting the story. They were focused on telling the story of these young men and women who were out here on the streets and also out there trying to make change in public policy. I didn't see a real issue happening as far as gender up until maybe like 6 months to maybe 8 months into the Ferguson uprisings. That's when I started noticing that the narrative shift moved away from talking about protests and police brutality into these conversations about gender. I started seeing people who were positioning themselves as protest leaders and leaders in civil rights, moving the conversation into um, Black women and the issues that Black LGBTQ people face. And there's nothing wrong with that, because those things are important. But what I saw was like a lot of the things they were talking about had nothing to really do with the original reasons why people were out there, which was white supremacy and police brutality. that's when I started seeing things move, and I started seeing like these conversations start to insinuate themselves into the public discourse and into the activist discourse. And a lot of those conversations were not coming from the grassroots, I can tell you that. I think a lot of those conversations were coming from academia, because all of a sudden academics realized that this was an opportunity to move Black people who are in dealing with those struggles into the mainstream public consciousness of people who were talking about activism and police brutality and white supremacy. Not to, again, not to say that these stories aren't valid and those things aren't valid, but they weren't why people were out there. People were on the ground and people were out there because their children were getting killed. They weren't out there for any kind of gender issues. They weren't out there for any kind of, social patriarchy issues and all this stuff, because none of that stuff was talked about on the street. Those are people, men, women, LGBTQ people. Those people were out there in the streets fighting against police brutality. I saw that in Baton Rouge. I saw it in Ferguson. I saw it in all these different cities. You didn't see that discourse about gender and about pronouns stuff start to happen, and that stuff started coming, insinuating itself into that. That was never on the streets.
What did you start to notice about how Black men were reported on, and was there anything going on in media that you definitely said, you know what, the kind of work I want to do is directly in response to that? Like, take us through your mind state, and especially in the last 3 to 4 years, about the kind of media you were interested in doing and what it was in response to.
Um, what brought me into the media I was wanted to do is the stuff is the same thing that brought me into it in the first place. I wanted to tell the stories of marginalized people. As far as like what the tone of my coverage is now, what really made me start paying attention to how some of this stuff was moving was I started going back to what I said earlier about how some of the conversations about Black men in movement spaces and what their position was, and how people who felt like they were being marginalized were starting to insinuate themselves into that conversation. I saw what happened first was people who talked about marginalization of people who were non-binary and were not Black men or straight Black men being pushed to the side. It moved away from inclusion to exclusion of Black men. And what I mean by that is I saw the conversation start taking on a tone of not being inclusive of other people, to this idea that Black men are holding back the rest of the collective. And we should not be centering Black men in this activist movement. Now, when I say activist movement, I'm not talking about the protest movement, because that's when I began to see that the activism and protest are two totally separate things. Protest is taking direct action against, police brutality, physically, legally, making disruption. Activism is when you started seeing a lot of academics started moving into activist spaces, protest spaces, and activism began to take over and become the foundation of what you see now. Is what we see as the protest movement. In the activist spaces, what I saw was people having this conversation about, that was coming from a lot of radical feminist thought, saying that men are patriarchs and Black men are patriarchs no matter what their social status is. Even though if you go back and look at the data, the overwhelming majority of people who were being harassed and killed by the police were Black males, especially lower class Black males. The Black male in America is at the bottom of every socioeconomic metric that indicates success in this society. But according to feminist theory or radical feminist theory, or I really should say misrepresented feminist theory, none of that matters. They are males, therefore they are patriarchs, therefore they are dominating the conversation, and we can't have that. That's what I saw a lot of the conversation starting to move into. I also saw the conversation move even further than that, to saying that Black males need to be completely eliminated from having any kind of space to speak on their own behalf, to even be able to have their plight be considered. And this was coming from people who were academics, people who work in media, in mainstream media, and people who have insinuated themselves into activist spaces and position themselves as leaders in those spaces. When I saw that, that's when I realized that I have to be I can't sit back and let that stuff happen and let that happen without it being challenged. And so as far as it interfering with my coverage, it didn't really affect my coverage that much. But what it did, it made me get very vocal about bringing data to some of these people, being vocal on social media about saying, no, this is not how it works. This is not what the truth of this is not what you're saying isn't the truth. It doesn't have any basis in reality. It doesn't have any basis in what's going on the ground. And it doesn't have anything that's really going to benefit Black people in general. This is an agenda that you're trying to push either to enrich yourself or to try to push whatever agenda or whatever philosophy or theory that you're trying to get over into the public. And we can't have that. That's not going to benefit us. So that's what made me do.
Okay. Um, Now, when I ran into you, it was on Twitter, and I noticed you had a number of dust ups on Twitter. Were you in the middle of it, handling business? Tell us a little bit about how you started to use Twitter, and what were some of the more significant debates and issues you ran across, on social media in the last few years.
I first got onto Twitter because I felt like it was a really good way to kind of just basically promote myself and promote my work. Um, there were a lot of people on there who I noticed it was, it's like really quick communication. It's a really good way to kind of like position yourself to be able to get your points across and talk to people. So that's why I did that. And I also saw that over time, there was sort of like a lack of real information and real scholarship when it comes to Black males and when it comes to like Black history and Black studies in general. So I figured, if I'm here, I already have the credibility I have from working in mainstream media. I can take some of the stuff that I know and some of the things that I studied and I'm interested in, like before it became Black male studies, just Afrocentric studies, Black studies in general, and started dropping some of this stuff onto the timeline in the Twitter. When I started doing that, that put me in conflict with a lot of people who had some of the agendas I talked about earlier when it comes to activism, specifically people who were academics, a lot of people who position themselves as Black feminist academics who either use faulty theory or they're trying to make a name for themselves and they're using a lot of theory that they have not read, or they're using half-read theory from a lot of Black feminist scholars who have been disproved and who have gone back on some of the things they said 10, 20, 30 years ago. But because there's so many young, impressionable people on Twitter, they go along with what these people are saying because they see a PhD in front of their name and they assume that they really have their best interest at heart. So basically what I did was I just would actively combat some of this stuff. I had a couple of dust ups with people like Brittany Cooper. Me and her have gone back and forth several times. She first came to my attention when the movie Harriet came out. And if you remember that movie, first of all, I didn't like it. It was a terrible movie, in my opinion. It was completely ahistorical. And there's a character in the movie called Bigger Long. Now, Bigger Long is a big Black dude that looks like a cross between Rick Ross and Suge Knight. He's a bounty hunter. The movie is set in 1834 in Tennessee, I believe. And this character is somebody who goes through Tennessee telling a white man to shut the hell up. I'm going to take the biggest bounty because I want to get all the white hoes I can in Atlanta when I get finished. There is no record. Anybody in their right mind who knows American history that there was no big Black man walking around talking like that to white slave owners in 1838. Brittany Cooper made this statement saying that even though he wasn't a real person, people like that existed. And I went and I basically said that there is no historical record and there's no way that you can say that sort of thing existed. But because she was connected to the movie and I don't know if she was a consultant or she was somebody who was connected to that movie and to that studio, she let this stuff rock. That's dangerous because you're a PhD and your whole field of study is Black studies, but you're willing to let this sort of misinformation go out and go unchecked to students who may not know any better. So I basically went back and found a lot of information about this sort of thing, and I said, no, that's not true. That never happened. These things never happened. And she got upset with me, and then we stopped talking. And that's happened to me several times. I've had a lot of run-ins with people who were academics or people who are pundits who push this narrative about Black males being predators and being patriarchs and being just evil in general to the point where they risk harm on Black men. And anytime I see that, I push back against it because it's dangerous. So that's what I've done now. I've basically built a name of myself where, like, if somebody says something hateful about Black males that can't be backed up by fact or data, they send out the bat signal and I check them.
That's why I consider you a Black masculinist journalist, because you're willing to do that. But tell me, how do you process that? Because there was a time period where either Black folk had to come out of HBCUs or we were formally unlettered, and we would have to battle with the academy in one way, shape, or form for the sake of, our humanity. You know what I mean? And now
Mm-hmm.
you're in this, and so Black studies ends up becoming the tip of the spear, at least at one point in time, where you actually could have Black folk who were trained, be it in HBCUs or white institutions, to represent and defend Black folk. And now,
Mm-hmm.
by the time you get to 2020 or so, 2018, 2019, now you're finding yourself having to battle not only the academy, but people who have degrees related to Black studies or somewhere in that area. And you yourself are not coming out of the academy with any formal training, but you have to be the voice of truth in the face of, people like Brittany Cooper, especially when
Mm-hmm.
you talk about a film like Harriet. I had the same issues with it, but this was a film seen around the world. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? A film that portrayed a very particular period of the African American experience as if Black men were right in line with white men in oppressing Black women. How do you process that transformation? Maybe we might say in a 50, 60-year period where, you actually have to defend against Black studies scholars in that way.
You know what? It's something that I'm still studying and it's something that I'm still doing research on. But I think in the 60s, in the 70s, especially, there was a very strong, a very powerful Black student movement, Black studies movement in the academy. There were scholars I'm blanking on right now, but you have scholars going back to, John Henry Clark, people like Frances Quest Welsing, who came a little bit later, even though she was in the academy in the 70s and the late 60s. You had a sort of a unified theory of Black studies that said that we have to create a curriculum that's going to bring in our cultural understanding of the society, our cultural understanding of African society, our cultural understanding of Black people in the United States, in the academy in America, and that is gonna inform how we put together curriculums and how we teach Black children and people outside of Black culture who may be curious about learning about this stuff. You can go back and look at old textbooks from the 60s and 70s, and you see a very militant Black academic movement in the academy, from HBCUs up until like higher education to a point. I think what happened, and a lot of people are going to be upset at this, but it's the truth. I think what happened is that feminism happened. And when I say feminism happened, what I mean is I think that the academy and white society and the white education system in America felt very threatened by the fact that there was this unified Black studies program that was starting to infiltrate the American academy. So what they had to do was they had to find a way to divide that. They had to find a way to dilute that. And I think the way they did that was trying to insinuate the white feminist movement into the Black studies movement. I think they found a way to use the white feminist movement and kind of siphon off Black women and Black studies and Black female scholars, Black women scholars into that movement and tell them that your movement isn't really based around Blackness. Your movement has to be based around gender, and look at the divides that you've been put in, and look at the place and look at the situation you've been put in because you're males, and which is ironic to me because if you look back at the history of African Americans, we've always had to deal with some of the same demons. Now, true enough, in individual cases, yeah, there's different levels of oppression for Black men and Black women, but we've always been unified in that oppression that is trying to push back against it. Even with the issues that Black women have with each other, I think feminism, as filtered through the academy, moved Black women away from that and told them that you don't need to be part of this and you need to have a division. We need to be your allies and let Black men fend for themselves. And I think that's what you start seeing. I think you start seeing around the time that you start seeing bell hooks come to prominence, Michelle Wallace, people who aren't even in the academy. You start seeing a lot of the books start proliferating in the academy and being part of curriculums like Alice Walker's work, Tara McMillan's work, things like that. And then you start seeing, because it feeds into this idea that we have to position ourselves as women, not as part of the Black collective, that filters from the academy into the mainstream culture, into things like the old Oprah Winfrey Show and things like that, where you see these images of Black men and Black women pitting themselves against each other. That informs the culture, that creates the divide, and then you tie that into social strictures. I mean, like legislative strictures that keep the Black men and the Black woman divided. This is what you get. And I think what we're dealing with now is two generations of this process, where you have all out war on an academic level of Black feminist studies that are completely against Black men in general because the rates of Black men that are going into the academy in the first place are lower. So therefore, there's a lot less pushback. And also, a lot of the Black male scholars who go into the academy have to listen to this rhetoric, and they have to go along with this rhetoric if they want to further their careers. It's dangerous. And I think Black male studies is coming about because of that. At
Yeah.
one point, there was no really need for Black male studies because you had a unified Black studies.
Yeah.
You need Black male studies now because Black males have been pushed so far out of the academy and they've been
Absolutely.
demonized so badly because of third wave feminism that really isn't based in Black feminism anyway. That comes from white feminism and Gloria Steinem. And if
Mhm.
you look back, I think there's just recently been some papers released that said that this was intentional, that the
Mhm.
government set some of this stuff up to kind of divide a unified Black curriculum that was going to go into the academy and completely shift the mindsets of Black students that were coming out of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
I need to find that data and get it to you, but I think that just came out a couple of days ago. That
Yeah.
this was by design. So that's what happened.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see, which data you might be referring to, but we can definitely see the fallout of it. I mean, even the discussions around critical race theory that are happening right now is still connected in one way, shape, or form to that legacy of wanting to exclude those Black voices. And those Black voices in the academy were tied to the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, these movements
Mm-hmm.
that were happening on the streets in the communities. There was a moment where they were tied in a particular way. And I completely agree with you where feminism becomes that split in many ways, and it's tied to policy. And this is the biggest thing I've been saying, because people like to give you a shorthand and say, "Oh, well, you're just promoting division between men and women." No, policy played a severe role in this because you're talking about, whether you're talking about resources, whether you're talking about, food on people's tables, whether you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
career advancements. There were very concrete material advances that were tied to what kind of side of the fence you were on these issues, and it's still playing out to this day. So this is why you and I can talk about professional Black men, be they in the academy, in the corporate world, or wherever else, who reach out to us under the table to applaud what we're doing, but they can't do something similar because their well-being is tied to, going along to some extent. So all of these things come to bear. take
Mm-hmm.
take us to the founding of Context Media Group. How does that come about, and what is your goal? What is your aim with this?
Well, I started Context Media Group because because of some of the issues I said earlier. When I was working in mainstream media, I always had to go through gatekeepers. It wasn't always bad because when you're dealing in that form, you have to take your stuff to an editor, and they usually work with you about what makes sense, what needs to come out, what doesn't need to come out, how you can streamline that. And when it works and they understand your vision for what you're doing, it works. But what I was dealing with a lot of the time, especially after around 2018 or so, 2017, a lot of the editors who were Black who were working in a lot of the outlets that I was working for either got let go or they got transferred out of their jobs. And I was dealing with a lot of people who did not know the culture, who didn't understand some of the language I was using. And I had to have a lot of fights with people about, all these people worth talking to. Should the story go out the way it is? This feels like a local story. And I was trying to and I got tired of telling people, yeah, some of these stories, you may not understand why these people are talking, and they may not be scholars, but they have a better understanding of what's going on in their daily lives than somebody who's sitting up in an office all day and doesn't interact with these people. So I really just got tired of that. And then I realized that I had spent the last couple of years around people who were basically telling their own story with a cell phone. They were able to go out onto the streets, kind of like what you saw in Ferguson and in Baltimore, where like if you go back and look at some of the coverage of mainstream coverage of Ferguson and Baltimore, you can see a police narrative. You can see a narrative from mainstream media like CNN and what they were reporting on. And then you see the narrative of people holding up their phone, walking around, showing you what's going on. Like, yeah, this is what's going on. The cops just beat up everybody. They threw tear gas at us. They shot point blank at us, but you never saw that on CNN. And
Right.
I had an epiphany and I said, you know what? I got access to a little bit better equipment than some of these folks.
Right.
They're using technology to basically tell their stories and social media. And I noticed that the media is taking some of the stuff that they're saying and putting it up with very little filters. This is around the time you started seeing people taking cell phone video and basically putting it on, on CNN and putting it on TV. And I
Mhm.
said, you know what? I can do the exact same thing that I can do. I can take what I know from mainstream media merge that with what I see people on the street doing, which is basically street journalism and independent journalism, and I can merge that. So
Yeah.
that's why I started Context Media. I just basically got a couple cell phones, got a high-end mic that I'd had, went around and just started talking to people. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I started basically interviewing people who were doing community work, interviewing people who were on the ground, connected to the movement, and just started talking to them. And I guess from people seeing that, I started getting more and more interviews. I started talking to like people who were organized on the ground, like people who were famous, who were doing like putting money into like drives for like food and that sort of thing. People doing food drives. From
Yeah.
that got into me talking to celebrities with like a little bit better equipment, up until the point where people like, you know, the Know Your Rights Camp people and Kaepernick's people were saying, we see what you're doing. We want you to start talking about some of this stuff. Come talk to these people.
Yeah.
So that's really what that came about, man. I think people just responded. I think people were tired of seeing these narratives about Black people being filtered through these voices who don't really have a respect for Black people, and they don't
Yeah.
really know Black people, first of all. And when
Yeah.
I say that, I don't just mean people who are not Black, because you have a lot of Black people who work in mainstream media who are just as clueless about Black culture as the white people are.
Yeah.
So that's why I started Context Media, man, to give people a voice. What I want to do with it eventually, I'd like to make it something where it can become an outlet, or it can become a headquarters for people who tell stories in different formats, either for like writers, people who have, I wanted to do documentaries through it to tell stories in full, so I can give more people a broader spectrum of what people are doing on the block. And when I say on the block, I mean outside of like the people in the Blackish world and the people in the mixedest world. I want to talk to people who are on the block, people who are going to work every day, people who have real day-to-day lives, which the majority of Black people do. I would like it to be a clearinghouse for that. That's what I ultimately want it to be.
Well, and what you're also referring to is not only the technology, but also how it's used and what the politics behind that use is. Because if you go back to like Rodney King, I know people are familiar with seeing Black men getting beaten in media, but at that time it relied on this random element. Somebody happened to be recording. Now in the Black community, we talked about those kind of things for generations, but for someone to be recording it was fairly revolutionary, and really it was really kind of a bolt of lightning amount of luck. Now, fast forwarding to Michael Brown, where we actually, see people starting to use their phones, starting to use social media. The interesting thing about that transition is being able to actually participate. Because I grew up in, I'm a Generation X. I was born in the 70s. I grew up in the 80s. TV wasn't something that we, could have a hand in making. It was something you watched, and that was it. You turned
Mm-hmm.
it on. If you missed your show, that was a wrap. You had to wait until the rerun. It was a very different relationship with media. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so, so when you start talking about cell phones, when you start talking about access to, like, even what you said earlier, you had a couple of phones, you had some computers, you were that there was a time, like, we went to the 70s, you walking around with a camera recording things wasn't even something people could process. It wasn't, you had to have major backing to have that kind of equipment. So I applaud what you're doing, because you're actually you're taking your skill set, you're using the access you have from this technology, and you're using it for a different purpose. And I'm really digging that, especially in terms of how you address Black men. You did
Mm-hmm.
something very recently in Ferguson that I want you to talk a little bit about. Tell us a little bit about that. How did it come about, and what did you end up doing?
Yeah. The first week of August was the seventh anniversary of the killing of Mike Brown. And there was a seminar. There was a lot of events going on because of that, but one of the main events was the Black Fathers perspective. And what that was a roundtable of Black men who had lost children to police violence, mostly their sons. And I was invited by Tory Russell, who's a brother who is very active in Ferguson. He was on the ground when the Mike Brown uprising jumped off. He invited me to come out there and moderate. And when he told me what the idea of the story of the show was, I'm like, yeah, give me the word, I will be out there. Don't even ask anybody else. So I came out there to moderate that panel. Um, I didn't quite know what to expect, but all the men on that panel were men who have had high profile situations with their sons being killed by the police. Mike Brown Sr., Father Mike Brown, Oscar Grant's father, who Oscar Grant was the young man who was killed in Oakland, that they made the movie Fruitvale Station about. Vonderit Myers, all these names would become hashtags that the world knows. And they were there. And all I basically did was, some of them I knew, some of them I met for the first time. And we basically just opened up the floor. We chopped we got everything set up. And I asked these men what it was like to be Black men in this society, dealing with the fact that your namesakes have been taken from you by the society. And the responses I got really affected me. And I didn't realize how much they affected me, because these men, and if you look at them, the way society looks at them, the way American society looks at them, you wouldn't expect them to be as vulnerable as they are. But these brothers bared their souls about the pain and the rage and the suffering that they've had to deal with ever since their sons were taken from them. And what was wild about it was that almost all these men, their sons were named after them. Mike Brown Jr., Vonderit Myers Jr., Andrew Clark III. So these men were men who had named their sons after them, and their namesakes and their legacies were taken from them. I can only imagine how horrific that feeling and how powerless that makes you feel. But these brothers came in, they trusted me enough to be able to let them tell their stories, and I'm eternally grateful for them for that. But what it really made me realize was that when everything was done, those brothers came over to me and they basically told me, man, we appreciate you coming out here to do this. Nobody's ever talked to us.
And that's the piece that bothers me, because I've even done some shows about this on YouTube where I talk about the absence of the Black father experience in some of these deaths. One of the things that I saw really reach when it reached the crescendo was I think it was the Democrat National Convention, and they had the kind of mothers of the movement kind of on stage, and these were mothers who had lost their sons, and it
Mm-hmm.
was for me it was such a striking moment where it was like there's no sense whatsoever that fathers even exist for these men. And nobody seemed to care. Like I noticed nobody really raised the question. And that's one of the things that began to really bother me. So this is one of the reasons I was even more drawn to your work, because when I saw you do that piece, and I think you did it with a brother that I've had on my show before, who refers to himself
Mm-hmm.
as hood scholar. It was one of those moments where I was applauding, because I'm like, man, nobody else is really doing this and even acknowledging that these fathers have lost something. So I've done, individual shows, and I've commented on this in the past before as well. What do you think is behind the absence of the Black father in these discussions? What do you think is behind that, and what drives it in your assessment?
I think what drives that is some of the things I mentioned before that are driving the absence of the consideration of Black male pain in the academy. I think there is a very definite agenda in place to push Black males completely out of the equation when it comes to activist work and when it comes to even acknowledging their pain. To go, if you want to get, if we have to go all the way back to the beginning of this, Black people in America have never really been seen as full human beings. Um, we were brought here to be basically brute beasts of work, to be brutalized, to be dehumanized. And part of that dehumanization is taking away the idea that we have any kind of inner life or any kind of inner capacity for pain and suffering that needs to be acknowledged. What I mean by that is, like, I think this society says that pain and suffering is the natural state of Black people. And I think for Black men, that's exceptionally true, to the point where we don't have, I think the society feels like we don't have any kind of pain or any kind of emotional or psychological damage that deserves to be paid attention to. Now, what you're seeing now is a lot of Black people who work in activist spaces and in media spaces acknowledge that, and they've accepted that. Some of it I think is unconscious, but some of that I think is deliberate. They feel like that Black men don't really deserve to have their voices heard because Black women have been systematically frozen out of certain spaces. And to a certain extent, yeah, there has been issues in certain movement spaces where Black women have been pushed out, but I don't think it's been to the degree that they're trying to make this out to be. Now, you have a lot of ahistorical narratives going around about how Black women have been marginalized. And I think some of that's informing some of this, along with traditional ideas about what Black men deserve to endure, what they deserve to have. I think that's what part of it is. Some of it, and the other part of it is there's several Black organizations, well, Black in name only, and there's a lot of Black scholars who are reaping the benefits financially of a lot of this stuff. There are a lot of financial incentives for Black women in movement spaces that don't trickle down to Black men. There's very few, if any, grants. There's very few, if any, um, initiatives and financial initiatives that are going to Black men and help uplift Black men and get their voices heard. So there's a financial incentive for a lot of these scholars. Well, you know what? I don't like to call them scholars. There's a financial incentive for a lot of these academics to kind of marginalize Black men and pretend they don't exist, because with them out of the way, they can position themselves a little bit better and they can grab more grant dollars. They can grab more donations and funding. I think that's part of it too.
Absolutely. Going back to you've set up Context Media. You've
Mhm.
been active on social media. You're reporting on this, and you're getting involved in different kinds of projects where you're being invited out. Tell us about what it's like to run a small media company, and what are some of the hurdles or some of the difficulties that someone should be mindful of if they want to follow what you followed. You mentioned a little bit about some experiences you had recently where other people's motivations aren't always on the up and up when trying to interact with you. What would you tell someone who's trying to do what you're doing to look out for?
I would tell somebody who's trying to do what I do or trying to find their own way. Um, the first thing you have to do is be clear about what you want to report on and what your voice is. Um, because when you come into journalism and when you come into trying to tell these stories, you're always going to have pushback. You're always going to have people second guessing what you're doing and why you're doing it. So you have to be very clear from the jump about what you're trying to achieve and what your stories are about and what you're about. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to be very creative about funding unless you're going to go directly to some sort of funding source, because it is a struggle. If you're starting an independent journalism, if you're starting with independent journalism, starting a company, it's a fight to try to find out funding and try to find where your funding is going to come from if you're not doing it out of pocket. You have to, and even when you're dealing with funding, you have to be careful with that, because a lot of times there is funding and there's grants out here, but a lot of times when people give you their money, they want to give you their advice, and they see that and they think they're buying their control of you with funding. So you have to make some really hard decisions about what you're willing to give up, what you're willing to compromise, and what you're not willing to compromise, because that's going to be there. That's going to come to you. The more you build a platform, the more your platform grows, the more attractive you're going to look to certain people because they want your influence. You have to decide what you're going to do with that influence and how you can leverage that to say what you want to say and get the stories you want to tell out without compromising people's trust in you, without compromising your own integrity. But the main thing is be very, very clear about what you want to say. Be very, very clear about how you want to direct the stories you want to tell, and also be aware of the fact that you're going to have people who are going to fight back against you. You know what I mean? There is very much an element of crab bucket syndrome, for lack of a better term. There's a very much an element of jealousy in a lot of the stuff that goes on. Some of it you'll see up front, some of it you may not see, and it'll be in the background. But you just have to be very wary about people who are coming to help you, quote unquote, and people who are trying to save you. You just have to be clear.
Okay. Um, Last question. Um, how, as you see it, what is the future of the type of journalism you're trying to do, and where you think it needs to go in light of what we see on the horizon, in the environments we're in? What do you think needs to happen next?
I think there needs to be more of a focus on giving people in communities the tools to be able to tell their own stories, or at least try to set up situations where people who are mentors people to mentor people who want to tell their own stories, because there's a lot of talent out here. We just saw that, like, over the past 4 years we've seen people being able to like contradict some of the narratives that happened on the streets, with protests. I think there's a lot of gifted people out there who can tell their stories. I think what has to happen is there has to be a link up between people who are in mainstream media and in independent journalism, who are finding people who have really valid, credible stories to tell, and get them all together and try to set up platforms for them to speak. I think it's starting to happen a little bit. I know that there's the Black News Channel. Roland Martin does his thing. There's channels like yourself. There's brothers who are doing things like Tim Black. There's myself. There's people who have enough influence to kind of like build these things out and tell the stories for people who would normally never get any kind of chance to tell that story. But I think that has to happen. There also has to be, I don't want to say a conglomeration, but there has to be, I think, networking among the people who are telling these stories, like me, you, other people, to try to build on these things and make that happen. You can only do so much with one person in one city. There has to be a lot of networking, and there has to be a lot of cooperation that happens around the board. And bringing people who work in mainstream media, like I said, who may not want to be in front of the camera, but they may have the connections and they may have the skill set to impart on some of these people who don't know things. Like I'm still learning. There's things that I don't know. Every day I find things that I don't know that I need to learn. And there's a lot of people out here who I feel like are doing the same thing, and that has to be built. You got to get out of this crab bucket idea and get out of this one man band thing and try to learn how to build with each other. That's what I think.
And what can the Black community do a better job of to support? Because I think one of the things that's lost is an appreciation for not only media or a particular type of Black made media, but even more specifically in journalism and investigative journalists. I mean, you're talking about a generation now who've never even seen what investigative journalism is supposed to look like. And I think there's a sense that either it's not that important or it's not even part of the discussion because it hasn't been around in so long. You know what I mean? What do you think needs to happen to kind of gives people a sense of the value of both in useful journalism as well as useful Black made media? What do you think needs to be done to introduce people to the value of that and remind them, or for some people for the first time, show them why it's important? Like, what do you think needs to happen?
I think there needs to be an education process in that. I think most people, if you go, I think if you go to most people in the Black community, I think they already have an awareness of the power of investigative journalism, even though they may not know that. Even if you go, I mean, look, you go to any barbershop, you go to any gathering of 4 or 5 people over the age of 15 on any block, everybody knows about the CIA flooding the inner cities with crack in the 1980s. How do they know that? Because of the Gary Webb story. And me and the Gary Webb story was the white guy who did investigative journalism and found out that the CIA was basically funding the Iran Contra wars by funneling cocaine into the country through Panama, putting it on the streets in Miami, in LA, and Chicago and major cities, using that cash to fund the countries under the table. They may not know the particulars of that, but people know these stories. A lot of times people call this stuff conspiracy theories, but all these stories are bared out by investigative journalism. And I think if people are allowed to make the connections between the fact that the things that the things you talk about on the block come from people who have put in investigative legwork in journalism and put these things together, I think that would help. But people have to see that, and people have to be able to have people around them to connect those dots. How that happens, I don't really know. I think there has to be more of an activist journalism stance where people are actually putting these things out into the world. We have social media here who is able to tell us these things. We got YouTube. We have outlets to make that happen. It's just I'm not sure how you put people in place to make it attractive to people to come in and see that, but it has to happen. People know this stuff; they just have to have the procedures.
Yeah, absolutely. And people also need to understand that folks lost their lives putting a lot of this information out there, including Gary Webb himself, who died under questionable circumstances. Many of us believe that something happened to him, but at the end of the day, this is this is not limited to Webb. People have lost their lives putting this information out. So this is so it's vitally important, and this is one of the reasons that I wanted to support you, is because I think that independent Black voice is needed, and it operates as a check against these kind of structures that incentivize these very particular ideologies that can actually be anti-Black community when you look at it. But we
Mm-hmm.
need those voices out there like yourself to say, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, and then explain why and give context to it. So I think the need for black made independent Black media, independent Black journalism, and especially Black male media that advocates for Black male humanity is vitally important. So I really
Mm-hmm.
want to thank you for the work you do, and of course your willingness to come on today. I know how busy you are. I want to thank you for what you're doing, and I want you to let us know how we can support you, whatever else needs to be done, because I think the type of journalism you're producing needs to be happening a lot more. So thank you for that, brother.
No, thank you. If people are interested in what I do, you can go to contextmediagroup.com. That's where all the stories that I have hosted. There's video walls. You can see the work I've done there. You can see the other writers I've hosted. As far as like for funding, if you want to help out that way, you can donate directly through Cash App. Cash App is Context Media LLC. Also on PayPal, it is Context Media LLC. And also, if you want to check out my YouTube channels, my YouTube channel is Tauren Walker. I'm actually working on some content there. I've been running around so much I've kind of like had to put it on the back, but I'm going to do that. If you
Mhm.
want to help out with funding, same thing. Cash App, Tauren Walker. Um, PayPal, Real Tauren Walker. And if you, I'm also actively looking for ways to bring in funding that would allow me to grow some of what I do and maybe start hiring people.
Mhm.
So if you're in those fields and you know those how that world works, my contact is really easy to find. You can find me contact at contextmediagroup.com. I'm open to conversations.
Yeah. And it's important people understand the financing you're looking for is not to buy the next Rolls Royce or any. It's actually what puts you on a plane.
Yeah, I don't need four houses. Trust me, I'm good on.
But that's what puts you on a plane to go to where you need to be to do this kind of work. That's what actually helps you get the equipment you need to tell the story in the best way possible. I mean, this is a very on the ground level of support you're looking for, correct?
Yeah. I mean, that's it's just the reality of living in a capitalist society that you have to be able to, fund what you do. And the things that I'm trying to do, and I'm having to realize that too. You can only do so much with one person. You have to be able to open up room for people who may be rocking what you're doing to be able to come in and help you get where you need to go.
Mhm.
And as I get a little bit more mature, I'm realizing that you can't be in this world by yourself. So I'm learning how to put that out there. You know what I mean? It's the hardest thing in the world for me to do is to say, hey, I need help with this, I need help with that. But that's just the world we live in, and that's just
Yeah,
the reality of it.
yeah.
So yeah,
Well, you understand that sometimes those there's the strings attached to that help can be a problem. So you have to be very
yeah,
careful about what kind of help you take. But if you can find the right kind of help, it's invaluable to what you can do. So
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the right kind of partnerships, you know what I mean? Collaboration is a beautiful thing when you're both on the same page and you're both trying to get to the same goals, you know what I mean? Even
right.
if you're doing different things, if y'all have a line that y'all trying to get to, it's
Mhm.
all good.
That's
Which
right.
is why, I love, and again, thank you for this. And I love what you're doing. I love what you're doing from an academic standpoint because I know how difficult it can be too, being as a Black male, having the conversations you have and giving visibility to the people you have, in an academic standpoint, because that's a hard fight. I know.
Yeah, it definitely is. And people like yourself inspire me to let me know I'm not crazy and that I need to continue doing it. So again, thank you.
No,
Um,
you're not crazy. The world is.
well, much appreciation, brother. I look forward to the next time I can invite you on. But thank you for doing this interview series.
My
Um,
pleasure, brother.
all right.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So, again, thank you for supporting the Institute for Black Male Studies. Please make sure that you go to the website, instituteforblackmalestudies.com, and you can support through either purchasing merchandise, which you can find in the menu under the merchandise link, or clicking on store and watching a number of the free interviews we have, participating and purchasing some of the webinars available, or joining the classes that are available. You can also send suggestions for future classes you'd like to see for on the institute website. This is an independent venture and is not financed by any corporation, by any university. Just like Brother Torn Walker's work, the work is independent. So please support. You can also go to Patreon and support. You can look for T.H. Johnson, T. Hassan Johnson, or the Onyx Report right there on Patreon, and you can actually become a monthly supporter of the Institute for Black Male Studies. Either way, we appreciate your willingness to support, and I hope you'll continue to watch and share the interview series with particular Black masculinist workers who are out there doing the work of representing the humanity of Black men and not just the stereotyping of us in one way, shape, or form. So, that being said, again, we appreciate your help. We hope you'll continue to support. And until next time, wish you well. Peace.